It is raining the way it rains in southern Indiana in April, thin and cold and steady, when a young black officer crosses the wet ground toward a low wooden building with light in its windows. He is a lieutenant in the United States Army Air Forces. He wears the same silver bars as the men laughing inside. He has trained for 2 years to fly the same aircraft they fly. And he is walking toward a door he has been ordered not to open, on his own base, in his own country. In the middle of the war, he volunteered to fight. He reaches the door. He does not stop. Behind him, in the dark, other officers are watching to see what happens to a man who walks in. Before the week is out, more than 100 of them will be under arrest, and the United States Army will have a mutiny on its hands that it will spend the next 50 years trying to keep out of the record. This is how it happened. Before we go further, one thing has to be said. The Tuskegee Airmen are real. Their training, their combat record, their Distinguished Unit Citation are documented. The men in this story, Benjamin Davis, Coleman Young, Roger Terry, were real men whose actions are part of the historical record. The arrests at Freeman Field in April 1945 are documented. The regulation that caused them is documented. The letters of reprimand are documented, and so is the day, 50 years later, when the Air Force finally set them aside. What is reconstructed here is the texture, the rain, the walk to the door, the things the men said to each other in rooms where no stenographer was present. The events are real. The men in them were real. The way it is told here is the closest the record allows us to come. The difference between history and legend is the willingness to say which is which, so that is what this will do. The men at Freeman Field were the second half of the Tuskegee story. The first half is the one people know, black fighter pilots, the Red Tails, escorting bombers over Europe and doing it so well the bomber crews asked for them by name. The second half is quieter. It is the story of the bomber group, the 477th Black Airmen trained to fly the B-25, a 2-engine medium bomber, and to take it into combat. They trained for it. They qualified for it. And the war kept ending in front of them while the Army decided and undecided and decided again whether to let them fight. They were built to be a weapon the country was not sure it wanted to use. And between missions that never came, they were sent to a base in Indiana where the war they were actually fighting turned out to be a different one. To understand the door, you have to go back 20 years before it, to a document. In 1925, the Army War College produced a study on the use of black soldiers in a future war. It concluded, in writing with the authority of the institution behind it, that black men lacked the intelligence, the courage, and the character to lead in combat. That study was not a rumor. It was policy. It shaped how the Army trained, promoted, and deployed 1/10 of its own manpower for 2 decades. So when the Army finally, grudgingly, agreed to train black pilots in 1941, it did so as an experiment it half expected to fail, at a segregated field in Alabama, under officers many of whom had read the study and believed it. The men who became the Tuskegee Airmen did not just have to learn to fly. They had to disprove a document, and they did. And the document did not go away. Their commander was Benjamin Oliver Davis, Jr. He was the son of the first black general in the United States Army, and he had gone to West Point to become the second. What happened to him there is the thing you have to know to understand everything he did afterward. For 4 years, the other cadets did not speak to him, not in anger. It was called silencing, a practice meant to drive an unwanted cadet out. He roomed alone. He ate alone. No one spoke to him except on official business for 4 straight years. He did not break, and he did not leave. He graduated in 1936, 35th in a class of 276, having learned a lesson the Army had not meant to teach him, that he could be entirely alone and still be right. He carried that lesson into command. It made him hard to read and impossible to move. Among the officers of the 477th was a young bombardier navigator named Coleman Young. He was sharp, funny, quick to anger at unfairness, and he kept a running account in his own memory of every insult the Army handed him, not to nurse it, but to keep the record straight. Decades later, he would become the first black mayor of Detroit, and he would tell the story of Freeman Field to anyone who asked, always the same way, always insisting on the same detail, that they had not been troublemakers, that they had been officers of the United States Army asking to sit in their own club. In 1945, he was one more lieutenant in Indiana, watching the same decision he had seen made a dozen times before, in a dozen towns about where a man like him was permitted to sit. There was also the press. Not the big papers. The black press, the Pittsburgh Courier chief among them, which had launched a campaign in 1942 with a simple double V, victory abroad against the Axis, and victory at home against the thing the Axis believed too, that some men were born to rule others. The Courier had reporters and readers inside the service. It printed what the Army censors let it print and remembered what they did not. When something happened at a base like Freeman Field, the Army could keep it out of the official file. It could not keep it out of the Courier. and so a second record ran alongside the Army's, kept by people the Army was not in the habit of consulting, waiting for a day when someone would go looking for what the official record had left out. And here is the thing the honest account has to hold. The country that did this to these men was the same country they were fighting for, and it was both things at once. The same army that trained them to fly, that pinned medals on them, that sent them to escort its bombers through the deadliest sky in the world, also wrote the regulation that put them out of the club. The base commander at Freeman Field, Colonel Robert Selway, was not a monster in a movie. He was an officer applying a system he had been handed and had chosen not to question. Above him were generals who agreed with him. Around him was a country that had asked black men to die for freedoms it would not extend to them at a bar in Indiana. The contradiction was not a flaw in the story. The contradiction was the story. The men understood that better than anyone. They had lived inside it their whole lives. It was not the first time Davis had to defend his men on paper. In the fall of 1943, with the fighter squadron barely blooded in combat, senior officers in the Army Air Forces recommended that the black pilots be pulled out of the war and reassigned to rear areas, citing a report that said they had underperformed. Davis had never been told of any such deficiency. He flew to Washington. He held a press conference at the Pentagon, and then he stood in front of a War Department committee and defended his men with the only weapon the Army respected, the facts of their record. The inquiry that followed found the squadron's performance was equal to any other, and then his pilots answered the question themselves, in the only court that mattered, by shooting down 12 German aircraft over 2 days. The report was buried. The men flew on. Davis had learned again that the record had to be forced to tell the truth, and that he would have to be the one to force it. Then came the record everyone remembers. Based at a field called Ramitelli on the Adriatic coast of Italy, Davis's 302nd Fighter Group painted the tails of their P-51 Mustangs a bright, unmistakable red and flew escort for the heavy bombers going after the oil and the factories deep inside the Reich. Bomber crews, white bomber crews, began to notice that when the red-tailed fighters were with them, they came home. They started asking for them. On the 24th of March, 1945, the group escorted bombers all the way to Berlin and fought the German jets over the target, and for that mission they were awarded the Distinguished Unit Citation, the highest honor a unit can receive. They had disproved the document. In the sky over Germany, in front of witnesses who had every reason to be skeptical, they had made the 1925 study a lie, and then the ones in the bomber group came home to Indiana. The 477th Bombardment Group never got overseas. The war in Europe ended while they were still training, moved from base to base, each move seeming to come just as they got close to ready. By the spring of 1945 they were at Freeman Field, near Seymour, Indiana. They were officers. Many of them had wings. Some had college degrees the white officers over them did not have, and on the base the Army maintained 2 officers' clubs, one for white officers, one for black officers. The regulation did not say that, of course. It said one club was for trainees and the other for instructors and supervisors, but every black officer on the base was classified a trainee, and every white officer an instructor, and so the line the regulation drew was exactly the line it claimed not to be drawing. Everyone understood it. It was written precisely so that everyone could understand it and no one could quote it. The building was Officers' Club No. 1. It had chairs, a bar, warmth, the ordinary comforts the Army provided its officers at the end of a day. It was, by every regulation above the base level, open to all officers. The men of the 477th had been commissioned by the same authority, sworn the same oath, worn the same uniform as the men inside. What separated them from the door was a single base regulation and a colonel's decision to enforce it. On the night of the 5th of April, 1945, a group of black officers decided they were done being separated from a door by a fiction. They did not raise their voices. They did not make speeches. They walked in 1s and 2s across the base toward Club No. 1 in the rain to do the most ordinary thing an officer can do, walk into his own club and ask for a drink. They went in. The officer on duty told them to leave. They stayed. Over the next hours and the nights that followed, the base command responded the only way the system knew how. It arrested them. Not for violence, there was none. Not for drunkenness, for entering. 61 officers of the United States Army were placed under arrest for walking into a club their commissions entitled them to enter. And Colonel Selway, understanding that arresting men for entering a room was going to be difficult to defend, reached for paper. He drafted a new regulation, spelled out this time, and ordered every officer on the base to read it and sign a statement acknowledging that he understood it. Signing meant accepting, in writing, that the separation was lawful and that he would obey it. It was a small thing, a signature. That was all they were being asked for, just their names on a piece of paper agreeing to their own exclusion. 101 of them refused to sign. They read the statement. They understood exactly what it was and exactly what refusing it would cost. And one after another, 101 black officers declined to put their names to a document certifying that they could be kept out of their own club. For that refusal, for the act of not signing, they were arrested too. It was, in the language the Army would later avoid, a mutiny, 101 officers refusing a direct order in wartime. But it was the quietest mutiny in the Army's history. No weapon was raised, no blow was struck. The whole rebellion consisted of men who would not sign their names to a lie, and who understood that in an army that ran on paper, the refusal to sign was the loudest thing they could do. They made the Army come and arrest them for the crime of leaving a line blank. This is the thing they understood that the Colonel did not. By refusing to sign, they had forced the Army to create a record. 101 arrests could not happen quietly. 101 officers, many with combat records, many with commissions the country had bragged about, could not be jailed on a training base without word getting out. It got out. The black press had it within days. Letters went to Congress. The men in the stockade were not agitators. They were, most of them, exactly the kind of officer the Army held up in its own recruiting, and now the Army was holding them behind wire for wanting a drink. Every hour they sat under arrest, the contradiction the Army had spent decades papering over sat in plain view, in writing, with names and ranks attached. They had turned their own arrest into the one thing the institution could not ignore. A record too large to file away. It reached Washington fast. The War Department, which had spent the war managing exactly this kind of embarrassment, moved to contain it. Within days, orders came down from far above Colonel Selway's head. The 101 were released. The regulation that had started it was rescinded. On paper, the men had won. The door was open. The signature was no longer required. And if the story ended there, it would be the clean story, the one where the system, confronted with its own contradiction, corrects itself. But the story does not end there, and the honest account cannot pretend it does. Because releasing the men was not the same as clearing them. Killing the regulation was not the same as admitting it had been wrong. The Army had opened the door. It had not yet decided to say, in the record, that the men who walked through it had been right. Here is what the system did after the cameras looked away. Colonel Selway was quietly reassigned. He was not disciplined in any way that touched his career. The generals who had backed him were not disciplined at all. 3 of the arrested officers were singled out for court-martial, and one, a young lieutenant named Roger Terry, was convicted of jostling a superior officer as he entered the club, fined and dismissed from the service with the conviction on his record. And into the permanent file of 104 of the officers who had refused to sign, the Army placed a letter of reprimand, not a medal. A reprimand. The official record now stated in each of their files that these men had committed an offence. The base went back to normal within weeks. The Army remained formally segregated. It would stay that way for 3 more years, until 1948, when a president finally signed the order that 101 arrests in Indiana had not been enough to force. So the men carried it. Not a story of triumph, a letter in a file. For the rest of their careers, and for many of them the rest of their lives, the official record of the United States government stated that they had done something wrong at Freeman Field. The men who had refused to certify a lie were, in the only record that counted, the offenders. Some of them never mentioned it. Some of them mentioned it constantly. All of them lived with the knowledge that the paper said the opposite of the truth, and that the paper was the thing that outlived men. They had forced the Army to create a record in 1945. Now they had to wait to see whether anyone would ever force it to correct one. That wait lasted 50 years. The corrections came slowly, and most of them came late. Benjamin Davis stayed in the service, and in 1954 he became the first black general in the history of the United States Air Force, and in 1998, an old man, he was advanced to 4 stars. Coleman Young went home to Detroit, and in 1974 became its first black mayor, and he told the Freeman Field story for the rest of his life. And in 1995, 50 years after the arrests, the Air Force formally set aside the letter of reprimand in the files of the officers who had refused to sign, and reversed the conviction of Roger Terry, and returned the fine it had taken from him half a century before. In 2007, the surviving Tuskegee Airmen were called to the Capitol and given the Congressional Gold Medal. Many of the men who had sat in the stockade at Freeman Field were dead by then. The record was corrected over their graves. The famous names are easy to follow. The generals and the mayors leave their own paper trail. It is the others, the ones whose names were on no marquee, that the story is really about. They went home and became teachers and postal clerks and engineers and fathers. Some told their children about the night in Indiana. Some did not, because it was not a victory, and they did not know how to tell it as one. They had done a small, exact, dangerous thing. They had refused to sign their names to their own exclusion, and they had made the most powerful army on earth arrest them rather than get their signatures. and then they had gone on with their lives carrying a reprimand they had earned by being right. The army takes its time. The men did not always live long enough to see it catch up. The record was wrong for 50 years. That is the whole story, and it is worth sitting with, because it is not really a story about a club. It is a story about the distance between what happened and what the paper said happened, and about how long that distance can last, and about the men who spend their lives standing in it, insisting quietly that the paper is wrong. They were right in 1945. They were right every year the file said they were not. It took the record 50 years to admit what the men had known, walking across the wet ground toward that door, that an officer of the United States Army had the right to walk into his own club, and that the only thing standing between him and it was a lie somebody had written down. They did not sign it. The lie is gone now. The men who refuse to sign it are what remains.